As I'm sure everyone is aware, justice is a prevalent and very volatile topic right now. While there's general agreement that justice has something to do with people being given their due, it's obvious we don't agree on what rewards, opportunities, damages, and punishments people are deserving of. And why is that? Well, what we believe someone is due is largely dependent on the value we attribute to them and our conception of fairness. For the majority of human history, most people around the world attributed varying levels of value to people. That is to say, the ancient world did not see all people as possessing equal value, and as a result, not everyone was considered deserving of equal treatment. For instance, take an issue like slavery. Ancient pagan societies viewed the world as this kind of cosmic combat zone, where the goal was to conquer your enemies. So, therefore, enslaving prisoners of war was seen as the natural consequence and just reward for victory in battle. As such, slavery was normative in many ancient cultures. Pantheistic societies, on the other hand, viewed the world as this kind of cosmic correctional institution. So if you were poor or enslaved, it was because you were getting what you deserved for something you had done in a past life. In short, because you had bad karma. Or take an issue like women's rights. In many ancient cultures, women were deemed inferior to men. Consequently, in ancient Rome, husbands could have forced intercourse with their wives and could legally rape those of a lower social status, like slaves, prostitutes, and foreigners. In ancient Hindu societies, when a woman's husband died, she was expected to burn herself alive on his funeral pyre. Tragically, slavery and the cruel treatment of women was commonplace in the ancient world. So what changed? Something happened in the Middle East in the 1st century AD that changed the trajectory of human history. Do you know what it was? A Jewish man named Jesus was born in Bethlehem. It is no exaggeration to say that any advancements in the area of justice and human rights are ultimately attributable to the person we know as Jesus of Nazareth. Why is that? Because the Christian worldview taught something unique and revolutionary. That all humans, regardless of their gender, ethnicity, or economic status, were equal in dignity and equal in their need for grace. Jesus created and died for every tribe, tongue, and nation, and he taught that we must treat the other, including our enemies, as we treat ourselves. In other words, because of Jesus, love replaced power and merciless justice as the foundational principle of a people group. It is no surprise, therefore, that as the Christian influence on the world spread, so did equal rights and equal treatment. For instance, in AD 538, Roman Emperor Justinian, inspired by his Christian faith, quote, redefined the definition of raptus as abduction, seduction, rape, or ravishment of all women, regardless of standing. Justinian's wife, Empress Theodora, was a legislative force in her own right. Inspired by her Christian faith, she is, quote, remembered as one of the first rulers to recognize the rights of women, passing strict laws to prohibit the traffic in young girls and altering the divorce laws to give greater benefits to women. Later in history, it was the influence of Christianity that led to widow burning being made illegal in India and slavery eventually being made illegal in Britain and the United States. As Alvin Schmidt said, even though the church did not always get it right, the teachings of Jesus did eventually get through, despite his error-prone followers. You see, only a gross perversion of true Christianity could ever support the injustice of slavery. As Frederick Douglass said, "I love the pure, peaceable, and impartial Christianity of Christ. I therefore hate the corrupt, slave-holding, women-whipping, cradle-plundering, partial, and hypocritical Christianity of this land." Unlike other worldviews, slavery is a blatant violation of Christianity. In Exodus it says, "Whoever steals or kidnaps someone is to be put to death, whether the victim has been sold or is still in the kidnapper's possession." And in the New Testament period, although the apostles had no political authority and were subject to the rule of the Roman Empire, which endorsed slavery, the apostles planted the seeds that would eventually undermine the institution. For instance, you can see the Christian principle of liberty at play in a book like Philemon, where Paul exhorts a man named Philemon to receive a runaway slave named Onesimus back as a brother and not as a slave. As Martin Luther King Jr. would preach, God is not interested merely in the freedom of black men and brown men and yellow men, but God is interested in the freedom of the whole human race and the creation of a society where all men will live together as brothers. Later in history, it was Christians like Frederick Douglass, Hannah More, and William Wilberforce who, inspired by what Frederick Douglass called Christianity proper, overturned the legality of slavery in Britain as well as the United States. And of course, it would be ministers like Martin Luther King Jr. who would eventually help overturn the legality of segregation in the 1960s. My reason for giving this broad historical overview before we dive into the current state of justice in America is to highlight what ideas have historically led to positive outcomes and what ideas have historically led to negative outcomes. To put it bluntly, if we are going to make progress in the area of justice, we need to embrace Christianity proper's view of the world and abandon a quasi or neo-pagan view of the world that breaks us all up into warring tribes. Listen, the Bible is the only ancient text that says, speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves. Defend the rights of the poor and needy, as it says in Proverbs 31, 8 through 9. And Christianity is the only worldview that requires those with power and influence to use that power and influence to serve the best interests of others. So with that context in place, let's take a 30,000-foot view of where we are today regarding justice in America before we zoom in and take a closer look at the issue of racial justice in particular. And as we go down the following list, I want you to notice that the order is determined by the rate of occurrence. So tragically today, over 40 million people are still enslaved globally. Forced labor and sexual exploitation are the main reasons people are trafficked, and hundreds of thousands of people are suspected to be enslaved in the United States today, with an estimated 20,000 victims being illegally trafficked into our country annually. There are over 800,000 unborn babies that are legally aborted each year in this country. On average, there are over 400,000 victims of rape and sexual assault each year in the United States. It is estimated that 1% of the total U.S. prison population, roughly 20,000 people, are in prison falsely convicted. There are about 16,000 homicides each year in the United States. Tragically, there are an average of 163 law enforcement officers that die in the line of duty each year. And there are an average of 3 to 7 unjustified fatal police shootings a year, depending on if you count for charges or convictions. And that is out of about 375 million or so annual police interactions with citizens. So, what should we take away from these statistics? Well, the first thing that jumps off the page to me is that slavery and sexual assault are illegal, but not a thing of the past. According to the State Department, the U.S. is one of the top 3 perpetrators of this particular injustice. So this problem desperately needs more attention, especially because it is one both sides of the aisle can agree on. That said, I also think it's pretty painfully obvious that the right and left tend to be selective in their coverage of these justice issues, which can create a distorted perception of justice in America. It's hard to have general agreement on what to prioritize if our media outlets aren't giving us all the information. I think we need to recognize as a people that we do a disservice to justice if we do not speak about and combat injustices in proportion to their severity and prevalence. We shouldn't minimize or exaggerate the scale of any of these injustices. If our media coverage, charitable giving, and criminal justice priorities are going to somewhat reflect the severity and prevalence seen in these statistics, then we have to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. For instance, undoubtedly, wrongful convictions are an issue that need to be addressed in our criminal justice system. Listening to some on the right, which tends to minimize this particular problem, you would think that wrongful convictions are as rare as dying of smallpox, which is not the case. There is a significant difference between an anomaly and 20,000 people, even if the system apparently gets convictions right 99% of the time. And while we must admit that a perfect system is not realistic when dealing with imperfect people in an imperfect world, there are changes that can be made to make wrongful convictions significantly less likely. Furthermore, while it is hard to quantify, often the punishment for those who are rightly convicted does not fit the crime, especially if you were poor. And just bear with me because we will explore this particular issue more in the next video. That said, I also think it's clear, and I want to say this as sensitively as I know how, that the pervasiveness of unjustified police shootings is not anywhere near the scale suggested by the left. who tend to give the impression that this is happening at the same rate as human trafficking, abortion, sexual assault, or civilian-to-civilian homicide, which is also not the case. There is a significant difference between 3 and 7 and tens or hundreds of thousands. Not in severity, of course, but in regularity. Again, there are police reforms that should and are being enacted that will make fatal shootings less likely, but it doesn't help anyone, the citizens or the police, for the media to give the impression that our criminal justice system is irredeemably broken, when this type of behavior is neither policy or regular practice. That is to say, it is the exception as opposed to the norm. We will also discuss this particular issue further in the next video. All right, so if you care about these issues, these justice issues just mentioned, let me suggest a few organizations that are doing really good work in these areas. The International Justice Mission is an organization, I think it's one of the largest nonprofit organizations in the world, and they combat human trafficking around the globe. So I would encourage you to look into their website, see the good work that they're doing, and donate of your time, your attention, and your money to what they're doing to combat human trafficking. There's another organization called the Human Coalition that's doing really good work to undermine the legality of abortion and support mothers through pregnancy and to when they have their children. And then the Equal Justice Initiative with Bryan Stevenson, their organization fights wrongful convictions and excessive punishment in the criminal justice system. So I would encourage you to look up Bryan Stevenson, look up the Equal Justice Initiative, and again, donate of your time and money to the great work that they are doing. All right, in the next video, I promise we're going to take a closer look at the history of racial justice in America, exploring both our tragic past as well as what I believe can be our hopeful present, as well as our hopeful future.